The uncomfortable routine. Kendall Devereaux's heels clicked across the gleaming marble floor of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 1, each step punctuating her arrival with a sharp, rhythmic echo that seemed to resonate through the bustling airport. The polished, deliberate sound was almost like a prelude to her entrance, announcing the arrival of someone who clearly belonged in the space, who was used to the attention and the luxury that came with it. Clad in a tailored navy blue suit that perfectly hugged her form, she moved with precision, a picture of grace and quiet authority. Her tailored blazer, just the right balance between corporate and casual, shimmered slightly under the fluorescent lights, while her perfectly coordinated handbag and accessories spoke volumes about the kind of person Kendall was: successful, meticulous, and always one step ahead. Her blonde hair was swept back into a neat low ponytail, and her sunglasses, though perched delicately on the bridge of her nose, somehow enhanced the air of exclusivity that surrounded her. Today was supposed to be just another routine business trip, a simple flight from Chicago to London. The meetings in New York had been taxing, and the constant back and forth of conference calls with board members had taken their toll. But today, as Kendall walked through the airport, a faint sense of discomfort gnawed at her. It wasn't anything overt, nothing she could easily pinpoint, but it was enough to make her feel out of sync, as though the world around her was slightly off-kilter. As she navigated through the airport's complex layout with practiced ease, she passed by travelers who paused to glance at her, some recognizing her from her frequent business trips, others simply noting the woman in the designer suit who clearly belonged to a different world. She ignored them all, focusing only on her destination, the first-class check-in counter, a place where the luxury she had come to expect from her frequent travels awaited her. The check-in desk stood ahead like a fortress of exclusivity, polished and immaculate. The attendants, uniformly dressed in dark blue uniforms, moved with an efficiency that only reinforced the high-end experience. One of them, a young man with a neat comb-over, looked up as Kendall approached and straightened, as if to acknowledge her presence. "Good afternoon, Ms. Devereaux," he greeted her with a practiced smile, his voice just polite enough, but not so effusive as to be overly familiar. "London today, as usual?" Kendall offered a brief nod, her lips curving into a tight smile as she placed her passport on the counter with a practiced elegance. "Yes, the usual 7 o'clock flight," she replied, her tone light but with an underlying edge of weariness. There was a flicker of recognition in the attendant's eyes as he took her passport, confirming her identity with just a glance. The efficiency of the check-in process calmed her nerves slightly. Her luggage was tagged for priority handling, the boarding pass printed with minimal fanfare. She barely had to utter a word for the process to unfold, as it always did. Loyalty to a specific airline had its perks, and Kendall had been a loyal customer for years. She took her boarding pass with a quick "thank you," and continued on her way, the routine familiar and grounding. But even as she moved past security and into the first-class lounge, something about her journey felt different. There was a tinge of unease that she couldn't quite shake, an unfamiliar sense of being observed, as though her every move was being scrutinized in a way that she wasn't accustomed to. She pushed the feeling aside, slipping back into her usual routine, walking with purpose, taking her place at the lounge's leather armchair by the expansive window, the one that offered an unobstructed view of the runway. A server, one she recognized from her past trips, approached with a tray of champagne. The chilled glass sparkled in the dim light, a small comfort. Kendall took the drink without a word, her gaze drifting to the tarmac beyond the window, where planes taxied and prepared for takeoff. She sipped slowly, savoring the moment of solitude before the flight. The hum of the airport and the bustle of other passengers began to fade into the background as her thoughts wandered. She knew her life wasn't typical. The corporate world had its rules, but Kendall had long ago learned how to bend them to her advantage. The meetings, the deals, the travel, it was all a means to an end. And yet, today, something felt off. It wasn't the heat that seemed to be creeping through the airport's air conditioning system, nor was it the restless energy of the people around her. No, it was something more subtle, something almost intangible. She couldn't place it, but it gnawed at the edges of her calm exterior. As she sipped her drink, Kendall noticed a new face in the lounge, someone who seemed to stand out amongst the usual crowd of business travelers and airline employees. He was dressed in a crisp pilot's uniform, his jacket tailored and impeccable. A man of average height, with dark hair that was neatly combed and eyes that carried an air of quiet confidence, he sat alone in one of the armchairs, reading a newspaper. There was something about him that caught her attention, though she couldn't immediately pinpoint what it was. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, so effortlessly poised, yet somehow different. Something in his demeanor, his calmness amidst the usual flurry of activity, felt like an anomaly. But Kendall quickly dismissed the thought. After all, she was here for business, not to get caught up in the drama of observing strangers. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A reminder from her assistant about the meeting she was due to attend upon arrival. Another email from her secretary, a list of last-minute changes. Kendall quickly glanced at the notifications and then slipped her phone back into her bag. When she stood up to stretch her legs, she found herself walking in the direction of the lounge exit, but she paused once more by the window. There, sitting in the same armchair, was the pilot, his newspaper now folded neatly on his lap. As their eyes met briefly across the room, Kendall felt a strange flicker of recognition. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about him, something different. Something that didn't belong to her usual world. But just as quickly as the thought crossed her mind, she dismissed it. She was a woman who valued order, predictability. She wasn't interested in the lives of strangers, especially not those who didn't seem to fit into her world. And so, she moved on, her heels clicking sharply against the floor once again. Today, like every other, was a journey to be endured, not savored. But Kendall would soon find that this flight, and the stranger seated beside her, would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world she had built around her. The flight takes off. Kendall settled into her first-class seat, a plush leather chair nestled in the heart of the spacious cabin. The luxury of it all was a comfort she had grown used to over the years. Everything was meticulously arranged for her ease, soft blankets folded at the ready, a small tray of snacks beside her, a pillow just so for comfort. First class, after all, was her domain. She knew the attendants, they knew her preferences. There was little about this environment that was unfamiliar, and the hum of the plane's engines, already powering up for takeoff, calmed her restless mind. She was, however, acutely aware of the faint weight that had begun to settle on her chest since the moment she had been asked to sit next to the pilot. She had taken a seat by the window, her favorite spot on every flight, the one that allowed her to detach from the world and take in the grandeur of the skies. But this time, there was a lingering discomfort, an odd tension she couldn't shake. At first, it seemed like a strange coincidence, the way she and the pilot, Julian Hayes, had ended up seated together. But the more she thought about it, the more it felt deliberate, and Kendall wasn't used to things being out of her control. She was a woman who operated in a world of calculated risks, where the unexpected was often anticipated. But here she was, seated next to a man she didn't know, a pilot of all things, when she preferred to travel alone. She couldn't help but wonder, why had the airline chosen this seating arrangement? What had been the purpose? Her mind wandered as the attendants busied themselves around the cabin, ensuring that everything was in order before takeoff. She glanced over at Julian from the corner of her eye, watching as he reviewed a few last-minute papers on his lap, the way his fingers held the pages with an air of confidence, the calm determination of someone who was used to making life-or-death decisions, someone who had worked hard to earn his place in the cockpit. Her thoughts faltered as he looked up, catching her gaze. There was something almost disarming about his smile, like he wasn't trying too hard, but was instead genuinely polite. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to his papers, but not before Kendall had noted the faint flicker of something in his eyes, a knowing glance, almost like an invitation to engage. She turned away quickly, refocusing on the magazine that had been placed at her seat. But the silence between them felt heavier now, the kind that makes you more aware of your own breath, of the small sounds that fill the air when nothing is spoken. The plane's engines roared louder as they sped down the runway, the familiar vibration of takeoff making the cabin tremble slightly. The moment the plane lifted from the ground, a rush of adrenaline surged through Kendall's chest. She had always loved that part of flying, the sensation of being lifted into the air, the weightlessness that reminded her of her own ambition, constantly striving for higher ground, always pushing forward. But this time, there was a shift in her usual exhilaration. Her thoughts were no longer focused on the thrill of flight. Instead, she was acutely aware of Julian's presence beside her. She looked over at him once more, observing how calmly he sat in his seat, the way he moved with a fluidity that spoke of years of experience. His hands rested loosely on the armrests, the only sign of the weight of his responsibility. He wasn't bothered by the turbulence that had caused a slight shift in the cabin as the plane climbed higher, nor was he distracted by the buzz of communication between the flight crew. He was in control, and yet there was something almost human about him in this moment. Her thoughts were interrupted when an attendant came by offering drinks. Kendall took a glass of champagne, though it didn't have the same appeal it usually did. She was no longer interested in the luxury that surrounded her. It felt hollow today, even though everything in her world seemed perfect. She glanced again at Julian, who was now reviewing some flight data on his tablet. For a brief moment, their eyes met again, and Kendall felt an uncomfortable stirring deep within her. "Is everything okay, Ms. Devereux?" Julian's voice broke through the silence, the smooth cadence of it almost startling her. He hadn't spoken to her directly since they had boarded, and his voice, though soft, carried an undeniable authority. She was almost certain he wasn't merely trying to make small talk. "Yes," she replied, her tone polite but distant. She wasn't quite sure how to respond, but his question had been so unexpected, and there was something about his calm presence that made her feel oddly exposed. Sometimes the altitude can mess with your equilibrium, especially for those of us who don't fly as often, Julian continued, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "I hope you're comfortable." Kendall smiled thinly, forcing herself to appear more at ease than she felt. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a little tired from the meeting." She quickly turned her attention back to the small screen on the back of the seat in front of her, her attempt at distancing herself from the conversation. But Julian wasn't deterred. He seemed to have an almost uncanny ability to draw people out, and it was clear that the surface-level pleasantries didn't satisfy him. He gave a small nod, but his expression softened, as if he was used to meeting people like Kendall, people who built walls, who maintained perfect facades. And yet, despite all the control she had over her life, Kendall felt an uneasy ripple in her calm exterior. It wasn't long before the attendants began their rounds, offering meals and snacks. Kendall selected a light salad, but her mind wasn't on the food. She found herself glancing back at Julian, who had put away his tablet and was now looking out the window. His gaze was far away, as though lost in thought. She couldn't help but wonder what thoughts occupied his mind. Did he, too, feel the weight of his career, the burden of his responsibilities? As the meal service continued, Julian spoke again, this time about something more personal. "I've been flying for years," he said casually, as though they had known each other much longer than just this brief encounter. "But I still remember the first time I flew alone. There's a certain magic to it, you know? You're in charge of the entire aircraft, the lives of the passengers, the mission to get them safely to their destination. It's humbling." Kendall took a slow sip of her champagne, surprised by the vulnerability in his words. It was an admission that didn't quite fit with the polished image she had initially projected of him, a man who had everything under control, who didn't need to reveal any personal weakness. And yet, there he was, speaking about the pressure he felt in a way that made her feel a little less distant from him. "I can't imagine what that must be like," Kendall replied, her voice more genuine than she intended. "The pressure of it all. I guess I've never had to carry that weight." Julian turned to her, his gaze softening. It's not easy. But it's rewarding. Every time we take off, we have a chance to do something extraordinary. And I don't take that lightly. Kendall sat back in her chair, the conversation leaving her with more questions than answers. She had expected this flight to be a mere transition between meetings, another business trip to mark off her ever-growing list. But instead, she was confronted with a reality she had never considered: the people around her, the ones who seemed so far removed from her world of polished meetings and high-stakes negotiations, were real. They had their own challenges, their own stories. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Kendall realized that her journey was no longer just about the destination. It was about the connections that were being made, the unspoken bond between two people who, in another life, might never have crossed paths. Uneasy truths. As the flight progressed, the luxury of the first-class cabin became less of a sanctuary for Kendall and more of a cage. The deep plush of the seat, the gentle hum of the engines, and the soft lighting, all of it had once provided a sense of calm, of predictability. But now, with Julian sitting next to her, it felt almost oppressive. The calm, smooth professionalism he projected only seemed to highlight the chaotic swirl of thoughts within her own mind. She had once prided herself on the precision of her life, the carefully measured steps from one success to the next. But now, in the company of this man, Julian Hayes, she felt as if her finely crafted world was starting to unravel. His calmness, his openness, unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. He was not like the other professionals she encountered, people who were happy to keep their distance, to maintain the kind of casual, impersonal relationship that made her feel comfortable. Julian seemed different. He had already shared pieces of his life with her, pieces that didn't match the persona she had originally projected onto him. He wasn't merely a professional pilot, he was a man who had a history, a set of experiences that shaped him in ways Kendall had never considered. And yet, she couldn't quite bring herself to admit that she was fascinated by him. She wasn't used to letting her guard down, especially with people who came from such a different world. After all, she was a successful businesswoman, accustomed to controlling her surroundings, making her own decisions, never answering to anyone. But there was something about Julian that seemed to cut through her walls, something that caused her to feel small in comparison. She wondered how he could be so unguarded, so genuine. And why, despite her attempts to distance herself from the conversation, she found herself drawn to him. She turned her attention back to the window, watching as the clouds drifted lazily below them. They were above the thick layers of city smog now, soaring high above the world she knew so well, and yet, the sense of unease that had settled in her chest wouldn't dissipate. She had always believed that she was in control, of her career, her relationships, and even her own emotions. But here, on this flight, with Julian sitting beside her, she felt like a passenger in her own life. The realization gnawed at her, and it was as though she could feel the weight of all her previous choices pressing down on her shoulders. "Are you okay?" Julian's voice, gentle yet insistent, pulled her from her thoughts. Kendall had been so lost in her inner turmoil that she hadn't noticed how much time had passed. The flight attendants had come and gone, offering refills on drinks, checking in on the passengers. She had absent-mindedly accepted a refill on her champagne, but now, she found herself staring at her glass, unsure of how much she had actually consumed. She blinked, caught off guard by the concern in Julian's voice. He wasn't the kind of man to push, to pry into other people's personal affairs, but there was something about him, something about the warmth in his tone, that made it impossible for her to brush him off entirely. "I'm fine," Kendall replied, but her voice lacked the usual conviction. "Just, a lot on my mind." Julian studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as though weighing her words. Then, without hesitation, he leaned back in his seat and exhaled a quiet sigh. "I know what it's like to feel overwhelmed," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "It's part of the job, really. We're expected to be perfect all the time. To be unshakable. But that pressure can build up in ways you don't always see coming. Kendall's brow furrowed. She had never considered that Julian, a man who seemed so composed, might have the same struggles she did. And yet, here he was, talking to her as if he understood the weight of her world. She had always felt that no one truly understood what it was like to walk in her shoes, the demands of her career, the constant balancing act between professional success and personal sacrifice. But in this moment, Julian's words resonated with her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I don't know if I've ever really been able to let the pressure go," Kendall said, her voice quieter now, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "It's always there, just underneath the surface. No matter what I do, it feels like I'm always fighting against it." "You know," Julian said thoughtfully, "it doesn't have to be a fight all the time. Sometimes, you have to let go. Even for a moment." Kendall shifted in her seat, trying to ignore the small pang in her chest. She had spent so much of her life building walls to protect herself, and now, for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something else, vulnerability, maybe. She wasn't used to letting people see this side of her. Her gaze drifted back to the window once more, watching as the world below shrank into a tiny, distant blur. For the first time since boarding, she felt a small sense of peace. Julian's words had struck a chord deep within her, reminding her of the person she used to be, someone who was capable of more than just climbing the corporate ladder, someone who used to dream beyond the limits of her work. But before she could dwell too long on these thoughts, the announcement came over the loudspeaker, clear and concise, just as it always was. They were beginning their descent into London. The calm of the flight, the strange moment of connection, was about to end. Kendall felt her pulse quicken as the familiar sensations of descent took hold. The plane began to tilt downward, cutting through the air with a certain determination. Her mind began to focus on the upcoming meetings, the pitches, the deals to be closed, the promises to be kept. She quickly straightened in her seat, adjusting the fabric of her suit and pushing her thoughts back into a familiar, more controlled space. And yet, despite her best efforts to recenter herself, there was an undeniable shift. Julian's words, his presence, had left an impression on her that couldn't be undone. The walls she had so carefully constructed around herself were beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure whether to embrace it or push it away. For a moment, she allowed herself to wonder what it would be like to live without the constant pressure, to live without always striving for the next success. To not be defined by her work, by her achievements, by her image. The thought was almost absurd to her, yet it lingered at the edge of her consciousness. As the plane dipped lower into the London sky, Kendall knew that the journey wasn't just one of physical distance. It was a deeper, more introspective flight that had taken root somewhere inside her, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. But one thing was certain, the flight was far from over. Uncharted territory. The plane had begun its final descent, the familiar buzz of the captain's voice coming over the intercom as they began their approach to London's Heathrow Airport. Kendall's mind, usually a razor-sharp tool in moments like these, was drifting. Her thoughts, once focused solely on business, now danced between moments of reflection and unease. She could hear Julian's voice in her head again, the calmness with which he had spoken about the weight of his responsibility, the way he had gently hinted that even he, too, felt the pressure. But it wasn't just his words that lingered, it was the way he had looked at her, as though he could see beneath her polished surface. She shook her head slightly, trying to clear the fog that had settled over her mind. There was no room for distractions. She had an important meeting waiting for her in London, a room full of executives and decision-makers eager to hear her pitch, her ideas. They were counting on her to deliver, and she couldn't afford to be unprepared, to allow her mind to wander into uncharted territory. But just as quickly as the thought had come, it was interrupted by the soft sound of Julian's voice, now quieter, as if unsure whether to speak at all. He had been largely silent since their conversation had started to veer into personal territory. He had been observing her in that still, careful way of his his gaze gentle but intense, always aware. She wasn't sure if it was an attempt to give her space or if he, too, had been processing their exchange. "You know," he began slowly, his voice low enough to keep the conversation private, "it's strange, isn't it? How we spend our whole lives building these walls around us, thinking they'll protect us. But then, sometimes, it's the walls that hold us back more than anything else." Kendall froze for a moment, the words taking hold of her in a way she wasn't prepared for. She turned her head slightly to face him, her eyes narrowing, trying to read the expression on his face. He wasn't looking at her anymore but was instead gazing out the window, as if the words had slipped from his mouth before he could stop them. Her breath hitched in her chest as his words sank in. She wasn't used to people, especially men like him, speaking so freely about the internal battles that everyone fought but rarely acknowledged. She had never been one to dwell on vulnerability, had always dismissed it as something for the weak. Yet here she was, caught in a conversation that chipped away at everything she had come to rely on for control. "I've spent so much time trying to be the perfect image of success," Kendall murmured, her voice softer than she intended. "But I think, somewhere along the way, I forgot what it felt like to just be. To live without constantly being on." Julian finally turned to meet her gaze, his eyes no longer masked by the professional facade he had maintained earlier. He was no longer the pilot, the man in control of this massive machine of metal and technology. Instead, he was just Julian, a man, with all the complexities and contradictions that came with being human. "I think you've been doing it all wrong," he said simply, as though the answer had been obvious all along. "Perfection isn't the goal. It's the journey that matters." Kendall laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the quiet cabin. "The journey, huh?" she repeated, her gaze flickering away. "I don't know if I can afford the journey. I have too many people depending on me to take detours." The weight of those words hung in the air between them, and Julian remained silent, perhaps sensing the underlying tension that had started to build in Kendall's heart. The truth was that she had no idea how to let go, how to let herself just be. For years, she had crafted a life that revolved around control, precision, and accomplishment. She had built empires with her mind, and yet, when it came to matters of the heart and spirit, she was a stranger to herself. She turned her attention back to the window, watching the landscape below as the plane drew closer to its destination. The London skyline was starting to appear through the clouds, the city taking shape like a great, sprawling organism below her. But even as the city grew larger, she felt more distant from it. London had always been a place of opportunity, a place where she made deals, where her power thrived. But today, the city felt like a distant world, one she couldn't quite connect with in the same way. "We're almost there," she said after a long pause, her voice almost mechanical as she returned to her usual persona. "I have a presentation waiting for me. I need to be sharp." Julian looked at her, his gaze steady. "Of course. You should do what you do best. But don't forget, you're only human, Kendall. You don't have to be perfect." Kendall bit back a sharp retort, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. A part of her wanted to ignore him, to retreat back into the hardened shell she had created for herself. But there was another part of her, one she had long buried, beginning to listen to what Julian was saying. As the plane began its final approach to the runway, the cabin grew quiet, the flight attendants moving with practiced grace to prepare the passengers for landing. Kendall could feel her heart beating a little faster now, the tension returning as she slipped back into her role as the powerful, poised businesswoman who had everything under control. But despite her best efforts, something had shifted in her. The landing gear touched the tarmac with a soft thud, and the plane slowed, its wheels gripping the runway with the precision Julian had no doubt commanded. As the plane taxied to the gate, Kendall couldn't help but feel that she was coming back to Earth in more ways than one. The businesswoman, the success story, was about to step off the plane and face the world once again. But now, there was a new awareness within her, a realization that maybe the path she had been walking was not the only one she could take. As the seatbelt sign flickered off and the plane came to a halt, Julian leaned over and gave her a small smile, one that conveyed something deeper than just politeness. "Good luck, Kendall. You've got this." For the first time in a long while, Kendall felt a genuine appreciation for his words. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply nodded, taking a deep breath as the doors of the plane opened. She had spent so long in her own world, locked in a battle of expectations and perfection. But now, there was a spark of something new, something unknown. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a while, she wasn't afraid to find out. Facing the unspoken. The steady hum of Heathrow's terminal buzzed in the background as Kendall moved through the crowded arrivals area, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. Despite the flurry of activity around her, she felt strangely disconnected from it all. People hustled past her, their lives unfolding in a blur of motion, but she moved through it like a shadow, focused entirely on the task ahead. The presentation awaited her, the negotiations, the deals that could shape the trajectory of her business for years to come. She was accustomed to this whirlwind of high expectations and sharp deadlines, but today, there was a dissonance, a nagging presence of something undefined. The weight of Julian's words lingered in her mind, even as she tried to block them out. "You don't have to be perfect," he had said. It was simple, almost too simple, but it had struck a chord deep within her. For the first time in years, she felt like the carefully crafted walls of her life might not be enough to shield her from the chaos inside. She didn't know how to shake it off, this feeling that something had shifted in her core. Her car was waiting for her outside the terminal, the chauffeur already holding the door open. As she slid into the back seat, she was greeted by the familiar scent of leather and the cool, quiet interior of the luxury vehicle. It should have been comforting, but today, it felt cold. The driver's polite nod was almost a blur in the background as she stared out the window, watching London's skyline unfold before her like a story waiting to be written. Her thoughts drifted back to Julian, to the brief but intense connection they had shared on the flight. He had said so little, and yet, there had been something about him, something that made her reconsider everything she had believed about success, about vulnerability, about what it meant to truly be alive. She couldn't stop thinking about how he had listened to her, how he had shown such patience, understanding. In a world where people saw her as nothing more than a polished businesswoman, Julian had seen her as more. He had seen the cracks in her armor and, rather than retreating from them, had gently acknowledged them. Kendall had built her career on being the best, on controlling every situation, every outcome. She had learned early on that the only way to get ahead was to be flawless, untouchable. To show no weakness. But Julian had suggested something different, that maybe it was okay to not be perfect. That maybe success wasn't about achieving an idealized version of herself but about embracing the messy, human parts of her being. As the car sped through the busy streets of London, Kendall's mind wandered back to the meeting that awaited her. She had spent months preparing for this moment, the flawless presentation, the perfect pitch, the unwavering confidence. She was ready to dazzle them, to seal the deal that would push her company into new heights. It was what she had always done. But today, as she rehearsed her opening lines in her head, she felt a strange reluctance to go through with it. There was a nagging voice in the back of her mind that wondered if all of this endless cycle of striving, was truly what she wanted. What if there was more to life than the accolades, the power, the endless pursuit of achievement? The thought was unsettling, like a door opening into a room she wasn't ready to enter. The car eventually slowed to a stop in front of a sleek, glass-paneled building, the headquarters of a multinational corporation she had worked with for years. It stood tall and imposing, just like the meetings inside it, formal, calculated, rigid. Kendall took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, her heels clicking as she walked toward the entrance. She forced herself to refocus. She was here to do her job. She had to be sharp. But as she entered the building, the tension in her chest only grew. The elevator ride felt like an eternity as it ascended to the boardroom, each floor a reminder of the people waiting to see her. The numbers, the projections, the strategy, all of it was a world she knew well. But today, it felt foreign. The doors opened with a soft ping, and she stepped out, greeted by the expectant gazes of the executives seated around the polished conference table. The room was exactly as she had imagined it, cold, sterile, professional. Yet the air seemed thick with unspoken expectations. Kendall placed her briefcase on the table and took a deep breath before she began. As she launched into her carefully rehearsed speech, the words felt rehearsed, automatic. She was hitting all the right points, presenting the data with precision, outlining the strategy with impeccable accuracy. But something was missing. She paused for a brief moment, sensing the slight shift in energy around the table. The room was still attentive, still engaged, but the enthusiasm wasn't there. She could see it in their eyes, an undercurrent of disinterest, as if they were waiting for something more. Something real. Kendall felt a bead of sweat form at the back of her neck. She knew this room, knew the people in it, but today, it was as if she was no longer the person they expected her to be. She had always been the one to command the room, to impress them with her expertise and unshakable confidence. But now, as she stood before them, the weight of her own vulnerability was more apparent than ever. For the briefest moment, she considered abandoning the pitch, walking out of the room and leaving behind the world she had so carefully crafted. But that would be impossible. She wasn't the kind of person to give up. No matter how unsettling the feeling inside her, no matter how much her instincts told her that she was not the woman she had once been, Kendall Whitmore was a fighter. So, she pushed forward, her voice steady but quieter now, more introspective. I know you've all heard the numbers. I know you've seen the projections. But this isn't just about growth. It's about building something that lasts. Something that's meaningful. The room fell silent, the executives exchanging glances as Kendall continued. She spoke with a newfound clarity, a voice that had shed its polished exterior, revealing something deeper, more vulnerable. We're at a crossroads. And the choices we make here will define who we are, not just as a company, but as individuals. We have the chance to create something that will outlive all of us. Something that reflects our values, our commitment to doing things the right way, even if it's hard. The shift in her tone wasn't lost on the room. She could feel it, the change, subtle but powerful. The energy was different now. The executives were leaning forward, no longer just hearing the numbers but listening to the heart behind them. For the first time in a long time, Kendall didn't care about being perfect. She didn't care about impressing them or achieving the idealized version of success she had always strived for. Instead, she cared about making an impact, about building something real. As the presentation came to a close, the room remained quiet. Kendall felt her heart racing in her chest, her palms clammy. She had bared a part of herself she had long kept hidden. The question now was whether they would accept this version of her, the version that wasn't perfect, that was willing to admit her vulnerabilities. The silence stretched on, and Kendall held her breath, waiting for the response that could change everything. The moment of truth. The silence in the boardroom stretched on longer than Kendall had anticipated. Her words hung in the air like a delicate balance, fragile yet heavy. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, studying her with the kind of intensity that made her heart race in her chest. The truth was out there now. She had revealed herself, not the unshakable, confident businesswoman they were used to, but someone real, someone who was just as uncertain and imperfect as anyone else. But was that enough? She wanted to look away, to retreat into the comfort of her previous persona, but she couldn't. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. This was no longer just about securing a deal or impressing the room. This was about integrity. This was about being seen as more than just a well-prepared, high-powered executive. It was about showing them that she was human, that she wasn't afraid to take risks, to be vulnerable, to fail and still rise. And yet, she wasn't sure if they would understand. Would they respect her for this? Or would they see it as a weakness? The room remained still. Not a sound could be heard, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of London traffic outside. Kendall took a slow, steadying breath, and as she exhaled, she caught a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The eyes that had once looked at her with clinical interest now held something else, something softer. The tension in the room had eased just a little, though it hadn't fully dissipated. It was like the collective breath the room had been holding was finally being released, and for the first time in the meeting, there was room for something more than just business. A hand rose from across the table. Andrew, the CEO of the company she had partnered with for years, who had always been quick to pass judgment, whose approval she had always sought. He was a tall, imposing man, his presence enough to fill a room. Kendall braced herself for the inevitable critique, for the sharp, calculated response that would bring her back into the realm of cold professionalism. But Andrew didn't immediately speak. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, his sharp eyes flicking between her face and the papers in front of him. The seconds stretched on, the silence growing heavier with each passing moment. Kendall's chest tightened, her anxiety rising once more. What if she had miscalculated? What if her vulnerability had cost her everything? Finally, Andrew spoke, his voice deep and thoughtful. "Kendall," he began, his tone softer than usual, "I'll admit, this wasn't what I expected when we walked in here today." He paused, glancing around the table before returning his gaze to her. "But there's something to be said for honesty. Something to be said for a leader who's willing to show the truth of their heart, not just the polished version of themselves we're used to seeing." Kendall's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face neutral, her gaze unwavering. The room was still, all eyes on Andrew, waiting for the next words that would determine her future. "I think we've all been so focused on numbers and projections that we've forgotten what really drives success," Andrew continued, his voice resonating with an unexpected sincerity. "It's not just about hitting our targets or looking perfect. It's about the people, the real ones behind all of this." He gestured around the room, encompassing the entire team, but his eyes never left Kendall. "And Kendall, you've just reminded us of that." A ripple of quiet acknowledgement spread across the room, the other executives exchanging glances, some nodding slightly in agreement. Kendall felt a sense of disbelief wash over her. It wasn't just Andrew who was reacting to her words, but the entire room. They were seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. And they were responding, not with judgment, but with respect. Andrew's next words sealed the moment. "I think what you've just demonstrated, Kendall, is something many of us are missing. We've been chasing success without stopping to understand the human side of what we do. And maybe that's been holding us back. So yes, I'm in. I'm on board with your vision." Kendall exhaled, the weight lifting from her chest. Her mind, which had been spiraling with doubt and fear, suddenly cleared. The world she had fought so hard to build, this fortress of success, was not the only thing that mattered. She had given them something deeper, something more essential, her truth. And in return, they had responded not just with business acumen, but with a shared humanity. For a moment, Kendall was overwhelmed. This was the validation she had longed for, but it wasn't the kind she had expected. It wasn't the kind that came from closing deals or impressing people with her expertise. It was the kind that came from being seen, being heard, being accepted for who she truly was. The meeting shifted from a formal presentation to an open dialogue. They started brainstorming, building off the foundation Kendall had laid, exploring ideas that stretched beyond the confines of the numbers she had presented. She was no longer just a source of information or a power player. She was an equal, a partner in the room, a person with something valuable to offer beyond her title or her reputation. As the meeting drew to a close, Kendall felt a profound sense of relief. The deal was still on the table, but it had transformed. It was no longer just a business transaction, it had become a shared commitment to something greater. And for the first time in a long time, Kendall felt like she wasn't just playing a part, she was living it. She shook hands with Andrew, her smile genuine for the first time in what felt like years. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for listening." Andrew returned the smile, his expression softer than usual. "Thank you for reminding us what matters, Kendall." As she walked out of the boardroom, her steps were lighter than they had been when she entered. The weight she had carried for so long, the pressure to be perfect, the burden of expectation, seemed less heavy now. There was still a long road ahead, and there would be challenges to face, but for the first time in years, Kendall was ready to face them on her own terms. And as she left the building, her thoughts drifted back to Julian, to the way he had spoken to her on the plane. He had been right. Success wasn't just about perfection, it was about connection. About being real, even when it was difficult. And for Kendall, that was the most important lesson of all.